Welcome to today's closing general session, Reimagining Bus Service in Your Region. Please welcome the session moderator, Timothy Kelly, Executive Vice President of Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County, Houston, Texas.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here and to welcome you to the closing general session, Reimagining Bus Service in Your Region. I want to thank all of you for hanging in for this last session. And before we get started, I'd like to give a round of applause to APTA and RTC for putting on a great show and being a good host for us all. I want to introduce our panel. We have a very experienced group. I'll introduce them. To my left, Henry Lee is the General Manager and CEO of Sacramento Regional Transit District.
Morning.
Chris O'Clair, Assistant General Manager, Planning and Customer Service, King County Metro Transit. Todd Hemmingson, Vice President, Strategic Planning and Development for Capital Metro in Austin. And Curtis Stitt, President and CEO of the Central Ohio Transit Authority. So we have a great deal of experience here, and I invite you to read their bios on the APTA app and learn more about their experience. And we'll start a little bit, overview our session. Our experiences in Houston and all the cities represented here. Reimagining your bus network is a transformational approach to changing the dynamics in our community. It's a very important element for transit to stay relevant, to attract new customers, and to provide better service for our existing customers. In Houston, we had a traditional hub and spoke system that was over 50 years old. It was designed when our city was much smaller, had one major employment center downtown. Over time, the city's grown. We have 3 employment centers that are as large or larger than our downtown district today. The hub and spoke system, even though we added crosstown routes, was not serving our customers effectively. A new look was required. We started with a clean slate, and the resulting new bus network has been well received with increased ridership, and the reality we still have more work to do. It's an important balance for all of us as you look at these principles of balancing coverage to provide service levels along with frequency, determining high quality service in the high density corridors with the highest ridership potential. In Houston, when we overhauled our service, we ended up with recommendations that reduce low-performing routes while increasing service on higher demand routes. Finding that balance was the challenge, but also the key to success. And so with that brief introduction, we're going to hear more from our panel, and there are audience participation opportunities. There's microphones as we continue the program. And let's start with a brief introduction from our speakers and overview. Henry?
Good morning again. I come from Sacramento. Sacramento is the capital of California, the 6th largest economy in the world. But Sacramento is a government town for a long time. The economy and public transit have not been kept up with our peers in the West Coast, such as Seattle, San Diego, and Portland. However, in the last 2 years, Sacramento regional stakeholders or leaders start to step up to make the Sacramento region.
It's on.
Okay. So in the last 2 years, Sacramento regional leaders start to step up to make the region economically viable. And Sacramento Regional Transit worked even harder and have made some bold and comprehensive transformation. One particular thing we did is last October, we opened a new entertainment sport facility. That is the world-class, state-of-the-art basketball facility. To prepare for that, we redesigned part of our light rail system and our bus system. With extensive preparation, we eventually, because before, downtown Sacramento really after work, it's virtually a ghost town. It's a daytime economy. But with this event, with the new facility, we're going to host about 200 events every year. So before the arena opened, the whole region was very worried about how people will get there, how your people will find parking spaces. And all eyes were looking at RT, Sacramento Regional Transit, to say, how are you guys going to step up to provide service for these events? Eventually, since last October, we expand our light rail service and the bus service, and we transport about 10% of the event attendees. The goal was 7%. We exceed that. And our service was excellent. Before, we were constantly under criticism about the cleanliness, safety, and convenience. We took that opportunity. We did a great job, and turned image around quickly. Within the first 2 weeks of the event, we received about 100 news media coverage. 95% of coverage were positive. And prior to that, we received lots of coverage. 95% of the coverage were not positive. Seriously. In the meantime, in last year or so, we turned our financial house around. We stabilized our agency by cutting the cost by nearly 10%, but without affecting our service. And we also made massive cultural change with new business model. And we launched the first mile, last mile pilot program with Uber, Lyft, and Yellow Cab. As a result, our fare revenue increased by 18% in this year. Our fare evasion rate in the light rail dropped from 20% before to 5% right now. So while we are building up our reputation by running business in the most efficient and effective possible way, the citizens in the region now ask us to optimize our entire system to serve the community better. So we start initiative called the Route Optimization Study several months ago, similar to JTA, Jacksonville Transportation's ROI, and the Houston Metro's system Reimagining.
Sorry. I think you had my mic on instead of yours.
Yeah, I think you're right.
We are serving about 2.5 million population in the region. We have one of the largest and oldest light rail system in the nation. But our bus routes, designed primarily 30 years ago, is not changing according to, based on the travel patterns and land uses, all those type of change. And also, the light rail and the bus are not well connected. So that's why we launched our route optimization study to redesign and optimize our entire system. And not just to reflect 21st century commuting needs or patterns, and also be prepared to embrace the disruptive transportation future, which will be caused by the autonomous vehicles. Right now, we are considering some ideas to expand the coverage and frequency with a concept we call community or neighborhood-oriented small bus network, and link this small bus network to the regional light rail system. And like Tim just mentioned, our downtown become less important. There are dozens of emerging towns and cities or activity centers. They need the service, and we underserved them. So we would like to say how we can add some or build the community or neighborhood-oriented small bus network or system within that community and link those, fit the riders to the light rail system. And also, certainly, we will try to work with the bike, the other TNCs, or the rideshare service to bridge the gaps of the first mile and last mile. And we are thinking about how to use the new technologies such as electric and autonomous vehicles. Right now, Sacramento region is becoming autonomous vehicle demonstration center by working with the Silicon Valley and other tech companies. We had 100 company organization, 100 company attendees last month in Sacramento to build an autonomous vehicle demonstration center in Sacramento. The effective way to really to embrace the AV future is to deploy the flexible, on-demand small bus systems circulating in the neighborhood or the community activity centers in an affordable way. So we can actually compete or complement with the other rideshare firms. So in a snapshot, we'd like to increase the coverage and the frequency to emerging activity centers. And instead of building long-stretch downtown-centric bus routes, we would like to redesign bus routes, circulate within various communities, and feed riders to regional light rail system. And also, add more early morning, late night, and weekend service. One last piece of information for our initiative is we're not just trying to optimize our system. We serve another purpose, which is we would like to, Sacramento, long as a government town, they provide very little local funding, dedicated funding to the transit. Compared to the other regions, we're 5 times less from the local funding. We'd like to, to use this route optimization study to develop 2 versions. One version is within our current financial constraints, what we can do. And another version is to, reimagine or imagine a much robust world-class system in anticipation of we are going to get much more dedicated local funding in November 2018 when we put a new sales tax ballot measure in in front of the community. So it's not just doing this. We try to use this to get much more money. So that's the basic fact about what we're doing.
Great. Thanks, Henry. Chris?
Good morning. So I just always like to start with context. I work for King County Metro, and it's the Seattle regional area. And in that area, we operate and work with our smart card system, 6 other transit agencies, the Washington State Ferries, and our biggest partner in the region is Sound Transit, a link light rail provider and a commuter rail provider. So just to give you context, Metro, being the bus system, was the largest provider in the area for many, many years, and now Sound Transit's coming on board. I'm really proud to say today that in 2016, if we look at our 100 peers and we look at transit ridership across the region, we have the fastest growing transit ridership in the country. And it's not just us, but it's us working with our partners. And that if we look over the past 10 years, we know that our ridership has grown 30%, also the fastest in the country, where our employment and population has grown 13% and 14% respectively. So why is that happening? And I think that's a lot of the meat of the discussion today, and I'm just going to quickly touch on 3 quick topics. The first is King County Metro, when we went through the recession, we realized that we couldn't continue our current policies the way we were doing them. As we looked at 60% of our funding comes from sales tax, local funding. and we had to cut our system, we were going to have to cut proportionally the higher ridership Seattle-based routes at a greater percentage. And those were just existing policies that were in place. And what we were able to do is come together with stakeholders across the county to move forward with adopting new policies and adopting a system evaluation. In this system evaluation, which we call our service guidelines, we no longer looked at proportionally cutting service. We looked at 3 major policies. First being looking at the productivity of the system now and in the future. So we annually look at land use data, jobs data, household data. Second, looking at social equity data. We annually look at our low-income and minority ridership in all of our corridors. And then third, looking at geographic value. So in order to move away from our existing policies that were proportionally based on percentages, we moved forward with this kind of what we call a 3-legged stool, where now we take an annual evaluation of our system and we look at where our investments need to go, and we do it based on productivity, social equity, and geographic value. And the success has been huge. I really want to state that. We have an annual evaluation report that comes out that where everyone knows where our investments are going to go in the near term, where everyone understands, we built a transparent, accountable process where everyone can see where their routes are and how they will be and when they will be invested in. We got buy-in across the board because it wasn't just about investing in the highly productive routes, but it was about touching the vulnerable populations. It was about connecting the centers that we know are growing. And so through the system evaluation report, the results have come forward. Our system has become more productive. We were able to go forward with cutting a small portion of our system through the recession and cutting those areas that made sense, that weren't just the low density, low ridership areas, but were areas where there was duplicative service, where we knew there were other connections. And we were able to maintain some of the low ridership areas with new types of services. So in all of this, we didn't do a system overhaul. We started with a system evaluation, which we call our service guidelines. The second piece of the puzzle that I think has made us successful in building our ridership is that in this, the jurisdictions could see where our near-term investments are going, but they couldn't understand where we were going in the long term. And what I've heard from the panel today is we are and have been a hub and spoke system where Seattle was the center of our system, and we know that our regional centers are growing at a higher proportion than Seattle, that growth is really happening in the Bellevues and the Redmonds where Microsoft and Expedia is going, and we need to show how we can work together with the land use, the regional partners, transportation partners, and building that together. So we worked over the last 2 years to build what we call our long-range plan, Metro Connects. And now what we're doing is we're connecting that service guideline evaluation, productivity, social equity, and geographic value, with what we have and know in our long-term function of where we will have a major system overhaul, and looking at how we're integrating with our regional partners, partnering together, and building out, so it's not a hub and spoke system, so it's an integrated web, and that we're working together. I think it's really important that those two pieces go together when I look at the success. They know in the short term, they being our stakeholders, our riders, people who invest in us, but they also have that long-range vision, so they can build the land use and the density and work together. The final piece of the puzzle is I know that's been an ongoing theme of this conference. We were also, at the same time as we were adopting these new service guidelines, we were able to adopt a new strategic plan. And that strategic plan calls for us to be a mobility provider. We are no longer just a fixed route bus provider. And in my new role as overseeing as a new assistant general manager, it's pulling those pieces together and realizing that we have the largest van pool program in the country, and we need to build on it, and we need to work together with our partners. We have an employer pass program that has 1,800 employers that are bought into our pass program, where 50% of our fare revenue comes from our employers. We have, working with TNCs, et cetera, we have a sandbox grant where we're looking at the last mile connection. And in doing this grant, we're not just working with Sound Transit, we're working with the City of Seattle, and we have major employers at the table in order to help us understand how to make that last mile connection. We also, as a mobility provider, are making sure that people are working together as we look at access to the system. And as we're investing together, we know we're investing in not just park and rides, but walk and biking, people dropping off, et cetera. And being committed to that whole perspective has been really critical in making sure that we can be the first choice in our region, but we're not the only choice, and we support all of those choices in our region. So those are the three keys to our success in the Puget Sound region.
Great. Todd?
I think I can just talk this way, so I'll set this here. We have just recently had our plan approved by our board in March after about a 15-month process. It's called Connections 2025. So we have not implemented yet, but we want to be like Chris and King County Metro in terms of results. That's what we're trying to achieve. We went through an extensive process, extensive public involvement throughout. We worked with our board very closely, as well as many, many other stakeholders throughout the process. And early on, one of the things we did, I think that was helpful, and we did it, I think, pretty well, but we could have even done better, was establish some clear goals and objectives and just values with the board about what we're trying to accomplish with this type of exercise. We had done a system reorganization of sorts about 6 years ago, and so we had not, like some of the other properties, we certainly studied what Houston had done and read a lot of press about what Houston had done, but we had a slightly different situation. We had felt like we had been making changes fairly regularly, with a significant one about 6 years ago again, but we're one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and so when we did that plan and implemented it, we basically had finished implementation. We knew it was time to revisit it. And we wanted to blend our own staff expertise, bring in a consultant to have that fresh perspective, and then engage the public and the board to have that inputs from multiple sources about how we're going to make our system better and keep up with the tremendous growth in our community. Our ridership was not keeping pace with population. So that was a troubling thing and one of the main reasons we wanted to take on the study. We, again, developed 4 main goals out of early on with the board. One was to match service to market. So we wanted to take a hard look at what type of service we're offering and how the markets are changing throughout our community. We know that the fixed route bus, the 40-foot unit, is not the right answer for a lot of areas. So we wanted to look at new mobility options, and we ended up doing that. We created a concept we're calling mobility innovation zones. We have about 8 of them, generally on the peripheral areas of our service area, where fixed route just was not making sense. Our subsidy per trip was way too high. And in some of those places, actually, we proposed to remove service, but our board was not comfortable with that. So one of the ways we worked around that was to come up with this idea of mobility innovation zones, where essentially we're going to do some kind of partnership, as many agencies, and you've heard at this conference, we're talking about with TNCs, microtransit, bike share, other solutions, ultimately autonomous vehicles in those areas. And only when we have an alternative solution for mobility, it may have very different parameters than typical fixed route, but only at that point was the board comfortable with us withdrawing the fixed route service. So we're working on that now, trying to learn from this conference and others about best practices, learning how FTA wants to manage those things, and so on. So that was one piece. Number 2 was ensure financial stability, a critical thing for every transit agency, of course, but we wanted to take a look at our productivity, how much we're spending on service, and how much subsidy we are providing per passenger trip, and see how we could reverse some trends that were not going in directions we wanted. Number 3 was increase ridership. The board made that clear. Let's just be direct about it. We want to increase ridership out of this plan. So that was one of the explicit goals, which drove some of the hard decisions along the way about where we're going to apply our resources, because we had arguments where we have service in one place, and if we take service and put it somewhere else, we might be able to improve our productivity by 5 times in some cases. So we would lay that out. The public heard that. We had a lot of data to back that up, a lot of good, all of our stuff, in fact, every bit of resources on connections2025.org, so we tried to be very open about all the data that we were using to drive some of our decision making, and that proved to be very helpful. And then the last thing, and perhaps the most, not perhaps, but actually the very most important thing, was to enhance the customer experience. And so when we were talking about why are you doing this, why are you changing our routes, we know we can't make everyone happy, and that in these types of processes and studies, there's hard choices to be made, but overall, we want to make transit more valuable for the community, make it meet people's daily needs better than it does today, and we felt like if we could accomplish that, then most of the other goals and objectives would actually fall in line behind that. So that was a driving force. The last thing I'll mention is a real emphasis in this effort, unlike the one we did several years ago, to think about the network and the system and how all these pieces fit together rather than just a route-by-route look at things. And so that was a big focal point for us going forward.
Thanks, Todd. Curtis?
Boy, I want to just sit here and say ditto, 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 because, there are so many similarities in what we're trying to do in our communities. There are so many similarities in our communities and the service we provide, but there are so many differences as well. One of the things, well, just as background, Columbus is the fastest growing city in the Midwest. Our MPO about 4 years ago projected that Columbus and Central Ohio would grow by 500,000 people by 2050. 2 years into that, because of the robust growth during that initial period, recalibrated its projections, and they're projecting now 1 million more residents by 2050. I've been at COTA for 18 years. I earned the moniker amateur transit planner my first year. My background as an attorney, I was general counsel for COTA for a number of years, but I have ridden the bus since I moved to Columbus in 1978, and I grew up riding the bus in Cleveland. So my approach to things is what makes sense for the riders. And that's a big challenge I have when I talk to our planners. I don't have a PhD in transit planning, but I have a PhD in transit riding. So when I became CEO a little more than 5 years ago, I tried to set us on a new course, at least in terms of how we think about what our responsibilities are. I look at public transit as an organization that uses the resources that are provided to us to help our community achieve its goals. COTA has no goals of its own. COTA's goals are the goals of our community, and our responsibility is using the public transportation resources in a responsible and appropriate way to move the needle in the right direction to achieve the goals of the community. And when a community is going to be growing by another 1 million residents by 2050, between 300,000 and 500,000 new jobs, the public transit agency is going to have to figure out a way that it's going to be able to keep pace with that growth. So much more I could share with you, but why we took on this challenge of restructuring our entire bus system. 68 routes, had a former director or vice president for planning who said if we cut 65 of those routes, we could be profitable, but we'd only serve about 6 neighborhoods if we did that. But in 2014, a fairly new employee ran into my office excited. She had a big orange document with brown print on it. Those were COTA's colors from 1974. And this document that she was so excited about having found in the archives was COTA's first annual report. COTA began operating public transit service in Columbus in 1974, inherited the system from the utility company, electric utility that ran the system for 40 years prior to that. And I took a look at this document. It was about this big. It folded up like a road map. And I looked at 2 panels. What was the budget in '74 honestly don't remember what that was, but what struck me was the system map. The 1974 system map looked almost identical to the 2014 system map. 14 years different, or 40 years different, but almost identical. The routes, the lines went out a little further in 2014 because the community had grown out further. There are a couple crosstown routes, but for the most part, it looked identical. Routes coming in from what 40 years ago were soybean fields and corn fields that are now burgeoning suburbs into downtown, merging on our north-south main artery, High Street in downtown, going north and south on High Street, and then back out. Every bus, almost every bus we had entering downtown merged onto High Street. Our business community, for the entire 18 years that I've been at CODA, has been demanding that we move those blank buses off of High Street because it hurts retail development. When I looked at this annual report and saw the map of our system, I thought, is this the best service we can provide today, 40 years later? You know, we're still operating on a paradigm that probably was more than 40 years old, more than 80 years old, probably 150 years old, because looking at the history of public transit in Columbus, there were horse-drawn coaches that were providing public transit that came into downtown from these communities out in the rural areas that are now suburbs, merged on High Street, went north and south on High Street, and the horses pulled those coaches back out to serve these neighborhoods. So the answer was clearly no, this isn't the best service we can provide today based on a paradigm that was passed down over the decades. So I talked to our vice president for planning and capital projects and said, listen, let's take a look at how we can improve our system. And let's begin just looking at some of our routes. So we budgeted a project that would begin to look at how we might improve on a route-by-route basis. And somehow that project morphed to what we initially called the Transit System Review, reviewing our entire system and trying to improve the system. And we had only one caveat. It had to be fiscally constrained with what we were projecting we could provide in service hours with the 0.5% sales tax that we were collecting. So we brought in, well, we started off this project with let's revamp some routes. We funded it for revamping routes. Then it morphed to let's redesign the entire system, but we did not change our funding. So my advice to you, make sure you fund your project for what you're really trying to do. If you're trying to revamp the entire system, fund it for that. If you want to do line-by-line review, that's great, but that's not going to get you what you need. We, as a consequence, ended up doing a lot of the work after our consultant left. But the consultant laid a great foundation for us, and as acronyms go in the transit industry, we moved from the TSR, Transit System Review, to the TSR, Transit System Redesign, because we were kind of modifying what the consultant left for us, and of course he didn't abide by the financial constraints that we put on him, and so we had to cut about $400,000 worth of service that he overshot the plan by. So we did this simply trying to improve the system, knowing that this system that we were operating was a 40-year-old CODA system that could never meet the current needs, not to mention the needs of a community that's going to grow by another million residents by 2050. So that's the background on what we are doing. We launched the system on last Monday of last week. We got about the response on the street as we expected. We knew there would be people who had studied, had listened for the last 2 years as we were working on this, paid attention to all the media that we put out, all of the commercials that we put out, all the giant billboards that were out in the downtown, the electronic billboards that were at our crossroads in the middle of downtown Broad and High. And we found out a couple of things. The older people, 40s, 50s, had a lot of questions on the street, but they were simply validating what they already knew. They wanted confirmation. Am I in the right place? Yes, you are. Males, 20-ish, had no clue. So if you're going to do this, that might be a place where you target your outreach to young male riders, because every male rider in the 20s and early 30s that I encountered had no idea what the changes were. But we are looking at trying to make these changes. We know that the ridership is going to dip according to what we've seen in other communities that are doing this. But we have a goal. We provide close to 19 million trips a year. Our goal is to provide 25 million trips by 25. And we know that this major initiative is going to push us a long way in that direction. We project a 10% increase in ridership over the next 3 to 4 years simply as a result of this change. I'll stop there and hear if there's any questions.
Curtis, that's great. I would echo one thing you said. Regardless of the best laid plans, be prepared to make changes. In the first weeks after you did, we were adding trips, changing sizes of equipments within weeks, even based on all the input we had. So that's a good point.
Let me say, you're right. And don't be afraid to admit you made a mistake.
That's right.
About 3 months ago, I'm talking about some of the very granular details in the plan with some of our staff, and realized one of the principles that we had in making the changes, straight lines on arterial streets, no deviations into the neighborhood to collect a few people here and there, requiring people to walk 2 or 3 or 4 blocks out to the arterial street. And we made a mistake on a major arterial. We deviated a route off of that arterial, and now you have to transfer to go on a straight line to get to one of our busiest areas of town, where a nationwide children's hospital has invested hundreds of millions just a mile and a half further on this street. So we made a decision already. We're going to have a change in place on the first Monday in September, because we acknowledged and recognized that we didn't adhere to the principles that we had laid out for ourselves in how we redesign our system. So we probably had 8 meetings with people in that community who were complaining about this problem. They weren't complaining in using the language that we used in terms of the principles for making the changes, but they recognized that this transfer didn't make sense to the riders. And so we haven't told them yet, but we are going to make the change at our next service change date in September. So don't be afraid to acknowledge your mistakes and engage with the community to hear what they have to say and be prepared to make changes if the changes are deemed necessary.
Good point. So one of the common things I've heard from each of you this morning is the importance of community engagement, getting rider input, just as you mentioned, Curtis. But in this business, we all know sometimes we have to manage up too. So this is for all of you. What important steps did you take to get support from your board for the plan and to get it approved. Curtis, you're probably the best one. You're on your way out, so you can speak honestly. The rest of us can't. So.
Anybody got a recorder going on here? On this one, our board, we've got an interesting dynamic going on with our board. We started work on this about 3 years ago, 2014. Around 2015, half of our 13-member board had less than a year of experience on our board. We lost some long-term board members, and we spent a lot of time trying to educate board members about this initiative and others that previous board members had approved and made decisions on, and that the new board was being asked to implement. So we pushed the level of engagement and detail down significantly so we could catch this board up. I'd caution you on how far down you push it because it's hard to bring it back up to the right altitude, but it was necessary to do that. And as a result, our board viewed this as a great opportunity to make changes and to do some modernization of our system. So it was pretty much a no-brainer for our board once they realized the paradigm under which we were operating and how old that paradigm was.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Just quickly, I've done these types of studies at 3 different transit agencies now, and one of the lessons learned, I think, is to try to create some, to use a term, a burning platform of some sort. So some compelling reason to do things differently. And then a couple of the properties I was at, it was financial. There was either economic conditions or otherwise where clearly we could not sustain what we were doing, and rather than make little incremental changes or just go to the worst routes and remove them, we said, let's think about this system as a system, and went through the process, and that was ultimately what led to approval. In the case of the most recent plan, Connections 2025, we have a strong economy. There was no financial imperative, and so we kind of turned it into a ridership imperative. We had flat to slightly declining ridership, and in some of our markets, significantly declining ridership. So that was what we used as our burning platform, is we have to change the way we do business, not only because our community is changing so much, but because of the new mobility options that are coming around. The competition, if you will, for transit is getting more intense because people can do, although in Austin we don't have Uber and Lyft, we do have other transportation network companies. We have bike share, we have car2go. So people have a lot more choices. So we framed it in that way. We have to change to keep up with things and to get our ridership back in the right direction.
The 2 lessons learned that I would take away is we were able to pull together a diverse group of stakeholders prior to bringing it to our board, and we went through an intensive 6 to 8 month process where we brought in businesses, social service agencies, elected officials from our jurisdictions, community representatives, where they were able to come to a consensus first, and then they provided that up to our board. And I think that was really critical so that the board could realize and provide some credibility to some of the things we were moving forward. The other piece is we acknowledge that we make mistakes, but we also are acknowledging that these are living documents. So we are actively updating our service guidelines every 2 years. And then since then, we pulled together that diverse stakeholder group again to kind of do a kind of an overhaul to make sure it is correct and reevaluate how we're evaluating the system. And that led us to Metro Connects, our long-range plan. They called for that. And so just committing to that, maybe it's not that you're making mistakes, but the system is growing and changing, and we want to adapt and change with that. It's been really critical because then they don't feel like we're building a plan that's going to sit on the shelf. We're building a plan that we're going to continue to work on together as we grow together.
You want to add anything? Okay, well, I'm going to ask another difficult question, hopefully that will help some of our audience members as they proceed down this path. A lot of competing interest and special interest, so to speak. as you make this system overhaul or fine-tuning as you go forward. So did any of you experience advocates or elected officials that were more interested in their position than the system as a whole, and how'd you work to deal with that?
I can.
Okay.
Sacramento, I think, like I said, Sacramento is a government town. Actually, it's one of the most diverse and the most dynamic region in the nation. You can, in front of the governor's building, every day you will see lots of people protesting there. There are lots of people like the full-time job is just protesting. In our board meetings, one person can speak 3 minutes for each board item. If you have 10 board items, then that person can speak 10 times. We have like over 20 different transit advocacy groups, all with different opinions, different ideas. So the first idea is just to sit down with them individually and sit down with them as a group. Just hear from them. What do you really want? 90% of time I found, they misunderstood lots of stuff. They don't understand what's really going on. Number one your complaint is, well, you guys, the fare is so high. It's among the highest. How high our fare? $2.75. But they do not realize our fare, the actual fare we received per trip is $1.35. And they say, oh, the BART is not even higher than you. I say, do you really know how high BART charges? They charge $9 to airport. The average fare price is about $5 or between 4 to 5. So lots of miscommunications, misperceptions. Once you talk to them day and night, they start to get together. They start to become your allies. And one of the most critical opponents of RT in the past was the Eye on Sacramento as a government accountability watchdog organization. They constantly criticize us last 2 years. Then I start talking to them, talk to the organization, different people in depth. What they were really worried about is the accountability. Then we start to take the ideas, implement the ideas, and then tell them what we can do, what we cannot do. Eventually, they are on the same page with us. They become, used to be the most critical of us, now become one of the strongest supporting organizations to us. That was a big change. The same thing we ask them, once we turn them around, then we ask them to talk to all elected officials, speak on the board meetings, on every item, asking them you guys need to support transit because the economic vitality is dependent on a robust, world-class public transit system. And we are way behind, compared to our regions. So sometimes I say we ought to be shameful of ourselves because we did not keep up. Some great success and some lessons too.
Anybody else on that topic want to weigh in? Okay, we've got about 10 minutes or so. So I want to leave some time for audience questions. I would ask you each to close. Tell us perhaps one lesson learned or one thing you would do differently if you had to do it again. Anyone?
I'll say one. With regard to lessons learned, I hinted at it earlier. I think working with the consulting team and getting that clear direction, as clear as you possibly can. You alluded to the coverage versus productivity discussion and that dialogue. And we've used that in other studies and try to dialogue with the board about we can't do everything. We don't have the resources. You can't do everything. So how do you strike that right balance? And I think we worked in that direction to some degree, but we did not get a definitive answer from the board. There was not they weren't willing to make that definitive
Choice.
tough choice, exactly. But in other cases, I think if you can get that up front, then when the times get hard, and as you all know, the people that come to the board are not the people that are going to benefit from the plan. They're the people that are benefiting from the plan typically. And so when times get tough and they hear those unhappy customers, but there's still these important decisions to be made, if you can hearken back to that guiding principles that you've established early on in the process, I think that can be very helpful.
I would say our big lesson learned is we use a lot of data and information. We're a lot more accountable now in how we make decisions. And once again, it's not just on the productivity, but we're including social equity and geographic value. But what we've done is we've made it too complex. So our board members, I kind of was listening to the story of always having to re-educate your board members. At times, we're putting board members in the position of almost trying to be transit planners with complex data and information. And we need to go through this complex evaluation, but find better ways to communicate the information to people that aren't transit planners and to kind of convey the priorities and how it meets the policy goals. And the second piece, of the puzzle here is we are using a lot of data and information, but at times we aren't coming across that we're listening to our customer. And so sometimes we can be too much of a data processing organization. And what we're looking at is kind of coupling that more with our rider surveys, our satisfaction surveys, and what the customer is saying, so that the data and the quantitative and the qualitative can come together to tell that joint story. So don't be too data-driven is where I kind of end on that.
Well, let me just piggyback on that, because I think what you just said really talks to the presentation of the message. How the message is presented is important. Often we do go in with data and inform our constituents, our neighborhoods, our residents, our riders, the elected officials, that this is the way it is, and this is why we're going to do what we're going to do. And we fail to see things from their perspective, and seeing things from their perspective is going to help us to make the presentation in a way where they can buy in. Where do you find buy-in? I really think it comes down to how do you present what you're proposing to do. Because everybody, I think, ultimately realizes that you can't do everything. The resources are limited, but we don't want to be the loser in this proposition, especially when we see there are winners somewhere else.
I just want to add last thought about no matter what we're doing right now, we are to build a new future. But we need to think about what the major challenges ahead of us. One of the major challenges, like earlier I talked about autonomous vehicles. That will change not just our transportation, and will change the way of our life. How we can be prepared to embrace that challenge in the near future. Not too far, not too long, maybe 5 years. Actually, last month, Silicon Valley, even talking about flying, vehicles. It's not going just on the ground, it's going to fly. So how are we going to try to, not competing with those, how to try to actually not just still maintain our market share and even gain our market share. That is some great topics should be in our mind to think about. And there are many different ideas talked about in different meetings, different seminars. I just want to put this question here, and then all of us can think about in the future.
Great. There was a lot of good information in a short amount of time, but we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. in the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Abul Hassan. I'm the Director of Public Transportation for the City of Anchorage in Alaska. We have followed after our colleagues in Houston, and we'll be doing an implementation overhaul in the end of October. So if you sort of understand the 50-50 coverage model, we're actually about at 93% in terms of the changes that we're doing. So I appreciate what you've echoed here in terms of lessons learned, the difference between coverage and frequency, straight lines and efficiency, and of course, everything that you have to gain from there. What I'm hoping you might be able to tell me is, from a goal standpoint, you focused on ridership increases. And we know through experience that when you implement something like this, there's generally a dip and then there is an increase, which is what you've stated. What are you doing outside of focusing on ridership? And what I mean specifically is, what are you doing to engage the community and businesses to do sort of memorandums of understanding or contracts? My friend there from King County might be able to appreciate that. You have some competitors that are sort of running business with Microsoft or Amazon as private shuttles. If you're in San Francisco, you might know them as Bowers. But along the same theme, from a business-oriented standpoint, what are you doing to be able to leverage contracts with the vendors to be able to get money back into the system? That's one. Two, as you move from a hub-and-spoke concept to a grid line-based system, the right-of-way where two frequent lines intersect becomes prime real estate. So what changes are you going through in terms of re-envisioning what those intersections look like from a substation standpoint? Thank you.
Take a shot.
I'm not sure that this is going to focus directly to your question because it does get back to ridership, but in terms of entering into contracts, we're working on something right now in Columbus that will provide every employee in a major portion of downtown a free transit pass, free to the rider, free to the employees. And the property owners in this special improvement district just about 3 weeks ago approved an additional assessment to pay for part of the cost of the transit pass, and we're trying to get some additional foundation funding and other funding to make up the difference. But in terms of looking at how we engage the community, this program was, I guess, proposed because we have a crunch on parking in downtown. And as a consequence, the developers say, the vacancy rates in office buildings are pretty high. And so the concept here is that if we can, through a program like this, get X% of the people who are using their cars and paying monthly parking to shift to public transit, that would free up those spaces and they could be remarketed as property managers try to attract businesses downtown because they'd have parking spaces to market with the office space. We did a pilot project with about 5 or 6 businesses, and we saw a sufficient shift to move on to the full project. So we think this is going to be a way that the business community downtown takes a different perspective on how public transit serves the community. Not just ridership, but it will enhance downtown development. It will assist the businesses that are the building owners, and as a consequence, it will also help ridership.
With regard to the second point of your second part of your question, I absolutely agree. If you're going to a more of a grid-based network where connections between routes become more critical, the pedestrian environment has got to be right at those intersection points of your frequent routes. In our case, we actively working with the city of Austin, who's our primary market area, to make pedestrian improvements at those intersections. Also looking at potential stop location adjustments, because as was pointed out, if you're going to expect your customers to make that step off one bus, step over to another one, they have to be safe and hopefully comfortable and convenient in doing that at those points. So it is a really important aspect of a system redesign if you're going to a grid network.
Real quick on kind of leveraging, I think you used the word contracts or MOUs. For King County Metro, we don't look at it in that perspective. We look at it more in a partnership perspective. And we bring in those employers really early on, whether it's in a service change or a capital investment. And just a couple examples of that, as I stated, we have the largest employer pass program we think in the country. Half of our fare revenue comes from our employers that are paying because of state laws and other reasons for their employees to have transit passes. And that's huge. So they're incentivizing everyone to get on the bus. But even more importantly, in our downtown Seattle and our Bellevue areas, our two regional hubs, we have them at the table where we're meeting with them regularly to look at investments together, because they know that the mobility is important in moving the economy. And they're bought into that, and they're making the investments in our 3rd Avenue, which is our bus transit area, to make it more safe, reliable, better customer experience, and they're spending money and time in doing it with us because they're really bought into that mobility. Now, I agree, we live in an area that everyone understands the mobility a little bit more, but that bringing them in early into that discussion has been really successful for us.
Great. We have time for one question here in the front.
But if you don't mind, not a question, but a comment spurred by the Sacramento experience and interest in the community bus program. I'm Joel Valinsky, the director of the National Center for Transit Research at the University of South Florida, but I was the director of Broward County Transit back from '83 to '93, so 30 years ago. We created the community bus program in Broward County, which is the Fort Lauderdale area, which has a fixed route, regular transit system, as does Palm Beach County and Miami Beach County, and Miami-Dade County. And we also have Tri-Rail, very much like the Seattle situation of the 3 counties and the rail service. But what we're finding is that the routes back then were trying to do too many things for one route. Curly-Q designs, a lot of deviations. It was nuts. So we decided to say, look, we need to straighten these routes out to give people more direct service, faster trips, et cetera. And what we want to do is cooperate with the cities. Usually counties and cities are cats and dogs. They don't really like working with each other very much. But in this case, it was a love fest. And what the county said is, look, we will use our federal funds or other funds to buy minibuses for you, 20-passenger minibuses, medium duty. We will pay for half of what it costs you to hire your own people to drive the buses in your community. We would recommend you allow people to ride for free, and you can provide your own community bus service in your own city, allowing us to straighten our routes out. A lot of your trips will be internal. That's all anybody wants to go to, the hospitals or the shops or whatever. And otherwise, we're trying to provide the longer trips. And what happened is we were able to create 30 different community bus programs. That carry about between 15 and 18 passengers per hour on these minibuses. That's pretty good productivity. And meanwhile, the productivity on the fixed route system, on the regional system, increased as well because you had more attractive service. It was just win, 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 win. And we'd love to share the experience with you if you'd like to.
We're trying to order some, small AV buses in 5 years.
Yeah.
Small autonomous vehicle buses.
Well, and they are running, as you probably know, in certain countries in Europe. They do have some really micro buses almost, maybe fitting 12 people or so, autonomous, and testing them out. So that's one thing. And the other thing is there's a program called Best Workplaces for Commuters. And this is a program that we at our center manage. And it's a way of incentivizing companies to provide discounted transit passes to make them more attractive to future employees, give them an edge on other employers that are looking to hire the new talent by saying, hey, look, we provide bike share, or we provide telecommuting, or provide a discounted transit pass. And like I said, it enhances their their appearance to future employees. So we've got about 231 companies around the country, and I think Microsoft is one of them. I mean, big shot companies. These are not small things. And I would just encourage anybody here to leave me a card if you're interested, and we'll hook you up with the program. So thank you.
Okay, great comment. I want to thank the audience for your attentiveness and wish you all safe travels on your way home. And please join me for a great panel today. I think as you exit, we'll have a video for next year's bus conference in Tampa.
Staying in the 80s around the Bay Area.
With very little rain chance today, looking like a pretty nice day to head off to our beaches.
We'll see a lot of sunshine out there.
Water temperature holding in the low 70s. St. Pete is such a cool city.
Particularly the last 3 games has caught everybody's attention.
And if you're looking for something to do, there's a lot going on in the Bay Area this weekend.
The Cuban is in town.
Right. What a great history.
Today, people pack Clearwater Beach to enjoy their fun in the sun.
Welcome to Tampa Bay for the 2018 International Bus Rodeo and Paratransit Conference.
You're at the conference now, but maybe you should be at the speech.